In just 5 minutes, a tiny silver crucifix sent shockwaves through the entire first-class cabin at 35,000 feet. Flight attendant Karen asked her to remove it, in the name of policy. But Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice, didn't even stand. Her defiant silence alone was enough to shatter the polished mask of prejudice. Was it a symbol of religion, or a battle-scarred declaration of survival from someone who refused to vanish? When your faith is treated like a threat, will you hide it or let it speak louder than anything you've ever said? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Heathrow Airport, Terminal 5. The hour was early, but the atmosphere was already on edge, like a stretched rubber band 1 second from snapping. Sharp echoes of heels striking polished floors pierced through the white noise of boarding calls and luggage wheels clattering over tile. Amid this chaos, a woman stepped through the sliding glass doors of the first-class queue, her movements precise, her presence unsettlingly calm. Jasmine Crockett. No entourage, no designer logos, just a dark charcoal suit tailored with purpose, and a worn leather briefcase that had clearly seen more courtrooms than fashion shows. Her shoes bore scuffs near the toes, but her posture, head high, spine like a steel rod, spoke of a quiet authority. What caught the light wasn't gold, but silver. A small, unpolished crucifix resting just below her collarbone. The kind passed down through generations, not bought at boutiques. Around her, heads turned, not out of recognition, but confusion. Who walks like that in a place built for rushing? They didn't know. They couldn't have known. This woman once faced down billion-dollar oil corporations in federal court and made them tremble with nothing but a closing argument and the fire in her eyes. She'd stood in churches still stained with the scent of tear gas, comforting mothers who had buried sons too young to be martyrs. She didn't demand attention, but gravity bowed to her anyway. And yet here, in this corridor of polished marble and platinum lounges, no one said her name. No one offered to carry her case. No one saw the war scars behind her silence. They saw only a black woman in modest clothes walking where most assumed she didn't belong. And somewhere behind the check-in desk, a pair of sharp, watchful eyes narrowed. And as she moved forward, the space reacted, not with noise, but with subtle resistance, the kind that comes not from alarms or raised voices, but from narrowed eyes and tightened smiles. Jasmine reached the first-class gate with the same composure she carried into courtrooms. But the moment she stopped at the counter, she was met by it. Karen, mid-50s, posture like a ruler, voice trained to balance politeness with condescension. Her eyes landed on Jasmine not with welcome, but with calculation. She didn't see the Harvard law degree, or the years of pro bono work, or the national headlines. She saw a woman dressed too simply, with no luggage worth stealing, and skin that didn't fit the mold. And then she saw the crucifix, not a flashy symbol, but a silver cross, aged, unpolished, defiantly visible. The kind of necklace that didn't match the champagne and cufflink world Karen was used to guarding. "Boarding pass, please," Karen said too quickly, already preparing for a problem. Jasmine handed it over in silence. Karen's eyes flicked down to the ticket, then back up. Name Jasmine Crockett. Seat 1A. First class. Everything matched. Still, Karen didn't move. Her lips parted slightly as she stared harder at the pass, as if trying to find an invisible smudge. "First class?" she said, more to herself than to Jasmine. Then louder. "Are you traveling alone today?" Her tone was light, but her intent was not. Jasmine nodded once. Karen didn't hand the pass back right away. She glanced again at the crucifix, collarbone it rested on, the quiet strength behind Jasmine's eyes. Her fingers hesitated on the edge of the paper, like she was holding something dangerous. And then came the judgment, thinly veiled. "You must be clergy?" she asked, tilting her head with a mock smile. "Or perhaps someone's guest." The words weren't cruel. They were worse. They were casual. Casual enough to feel practiced. Jasmine didn't respond at first. She held Karen's gaze steady and unbothered, then finally said, voice low but clear, "I know exactly where I'm supposed to be." Karen blinked. Jasmine reached for her boarding pass, and as she took it back, she added, "But thank you for the reminder." She stepped past the desk without another glance. She didn't need to prove anything. Her presence was the proof. Behind her, Karen stood stiffly, her eyes still fixed on the crucifix like it was a challenge to her order. And Jasmine walked on, calm and steady, into a space that hadn't been built for her, but one she had every right to enter. The gate had opened, the cross still shone, and she never looked back. The plane lifted smoothly into the sky, engines humming beneath the floor like a restrained storm. Seatbelt signs dimmed. Overhead, lights softened to a warm, muted gold. First class melted into stillness, the kind of curated quiet that felt more like a museum than a cabin. Jasmine didn't recline. She didn't sip the complimentary champagne. She sat upright, book in hand, posture calm but alert. The silver crucifix on her chest gleamed faintly beneath the reading light, small, weathered, unmistakable. It rested right over her heart, not as fashion, but as presence. A fact, a name tag written in faith and history. And from the galley curtain behind her, Karen saw it and stopped. No one else seemed to notice. No heads turned. No complaints whispered to the crew. But for Karen, that cross didn't go unnoticed. It landed like a spark on dry leaves. It didn't matter that it was quiet, that it was still. It was there, visible in a space that prized subtlety above truth. In her training, no one had said, "Monitor jewelry," but they didn't have to. Years of repetition had taught her what elegance should look like. Jasmine's crucifix didn't match the wineless and tailored suits around her. It didn't blend. It refused to. And that to Karen meant control was slipping. Just a little, but enough. In her mind, symbols like that, religious, raw, openly worn, didn't belong in first class. Not because they were dangerous, but because they made people look twice. And in a cabin like this, looking twice was the first crack in the wall. Karen stepped into the aisle like a verdict entering the room, silent but charged. Each step toward seat 1A was deliberate, sharpened by something unspoken but undeniable. Her body moved with grace, but her jaw was tight. Her clipboard had been set down. Her role now wasn't about service. It was about order, control, correction. She wasn't just walking toward a passenger. She was walking toward something she felt needed to be contained. The silver crucifix glinting against Jasmine's chest had become, in her mind, a provocation. It didn't blend. It didn't back down. And worst of all, it didn't ask for permission. She stopped beside Jasmine, leaned in ever so slightly and smiled. A tight, practiced smile that masked pressure beneath polish. "Ma'am," she said, voice low, clipped, too smooth to be friendly. "I need to speak with you privately, just for a moment." Jasmine looked up, calm, silent, still holding her book like it anchored her to the moment. "We ask that passengers in this cabin refrain from displaying overt religious items during the flight," Karen said, the words flowing too quickly, too precisely. "You may not be aware, but large or clearly visible symbols can create discomfort among our premium guests, especially when they're that specific." She gestured toward the crucifix, not touching but close, her fingers hovering like it was something toxic. "We've had passengers in the past express concerns when such items are worn this openly." She didn't pause to gauge Jasmine's reaction. She didn't need to. She was already pressing forward. "We strive to maintain a neutral space," she said, the volume rising just a notch. Sharp now, no longer hidden. "That's what people pay for here. Quiet, clean, uncontroversial, not to be reminded of certain things." Her eyes flicked down to the crucifix again, like it was a fire hazard. "I understand it may be personal, but in this cabin, some boundaries need to be respected." The words landed not like a request, but a reprimand. For a beat, Jasmine said nothing. She closed her book slowly, carefully, not rushed. The motion alone carried weight, like the slow drawing of a breath before a testimony. Then she turned in her seat, fully facing Karen, not with hostility, but with a gaze so steady, so direct, it made the space between them feel suddenly much smaller. The cabin around them seemed to disappear. Nothing else moved. No one else spoke. This isn't a message, Jasmine said, voice calm but cold, each syllable as exacting as a blade. It's what's left of me. Karen's mouth twitched, a reaction she couldn't suppress. This cross, Jasmine continued, never breaking eye contact, was with me in a hospital when my uncle bled out in a hallway because no one believed a black man screaming meant it was urgent. Her voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the air did. It was with me when I laid on the pavement in Mississippi, holding a torn shirt to my own skin to stop the bleeding while people passed me like I was invisible. Her hand rose, slowly, deliberately, and rested gently on the cross. It was here when I stood in court in front of 12 white jurors who didn't care that I was right, who looked at me and saw a statistic. I wore it anyway. There was no shake in her tone, no desperation, only precision. This isn't jewelry, Jasmine said, softer now, but each word still landing with weight. It's survival. It's my right to exist without shrinking. The space between them wasn't wide, but it felt like a battlefield, the kind where no one raised a weapon, but every word had weight. Karen held her ground, stiff in posture, her hands folded in a practiced gesture of control. She had the look of someone clinging to the comfort of rules. Rules that, in her mind, gave her authority without confrontation. Her tone remained calm, but her jaw was tight, and her voice now carried an unmistakable edge. This isn't personal, she repeated, as if saying it enough times would make it true. We just want to make sure everyone in first class feels comfortable. We have guidelines. We ask passengers to avoid wearing religious symbols that are too overt. Her eyes flicked again to the crucifix, then quickly back to Jasmine's face, as though it hurt to look too long. It's about keeping things neutral, respectful, for everyone. Jasmine didn't move. Her body remained still, but there was a current in her silence, alive, steady, electric. She stared at Karen long enough for the flight attendant's shoulders to shift slightly under the pressure of it. When Jasmine finally spoke, her voice was low, clear, and stripped of anything that could be misread as anger. You keep using the word neutral, she said quietly, but it only ever seems to mean invisible. Karen opened her mouth as if to interrupt, but Jasmine held up a hand, gently but firmly. I know this game, she continued, eyes locked on Karen's. You say it's about the cross, but it isn't. You say it's about guidelines, but nobody else is being asked to tuck away who they are. Karen drew in a breath, defensive tension rising in her chest, but Jasmine's words moved faster, cutting through the space like cold air. This isn't about comfort, Jasmine said. It's about control, about reminding me that this seat, she tapped the armrest gently, wasn't made for someone like me, about making sure I know I'm being watched. Karen swallowed hard. You're misunderstanding my intent. No, Jasmine said without raising her voice. I'm seeing it clearly. There was no drama in her tone, no flare of outrage, just something deeper. Something that spoke of years spent explaining herself in rooms that pretended to be polite while quietly deciding she didn't belong. Her fingers brushed over the crucifix again, not for show, but as if reminding herself that it was still there, still hers. If a white man were wearing this exact same cross, you wouldn't be here, Jasmine said evenly. You wouldn't say a word, and you know that. Karen opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. This cross isn't flashy, not political. It's just mine, Jasmine continued. I don't wear it to provoke anyone. I wear it because it's been with me through every moment they said I wouldn't survive. When I sat in an emergency room holding my cousin's hand while they ignored us for hours. When I lay bleeding by the side of a highway in Mississippi with no one stopping. When I stood in a courtroom full of people who had already decided I was wrong before I spoke. Her voice was steady, controlled, but there was something tightening behind it. Not emotion, not yet, but truth pulling back the curtain. I wore it then, I wear it now, and I will wear it tomorrow. Karen's shoulders stiffened again, but this time the fight was different. It was no longer about policy or tone or image. It was about the quiet collapse of the illusion that the rule had anything to do with the symbol at all. Jasmine leaned back in her seat, not in retreat, but in declaration. You're not uncomfortable with the cross, she said. You're uncomfortable with me wearing it. The words dropped into the space between them like a weight neither of them could move. The silence that followed Jasmine's words wasn't empty. It was full, thick with recognition, with tension, with something unspoken that everyone suddenly felt, but no one dared name. Karen stood frozen, her mouth half open, her posture faltering just enough to reveal the tremor beneath her polished surface. She had come expecting compliance. She'd expected quiet discomfort, a polite nod, maybe even retreat. She hadn't expected truth, raw, composed, and immovable, delivered like testimony in a courtroom she no longer controlled. And then, a new voice entered the room. It came from the seat across the aisle. Low, steady, aged by time but unshaken in its clarity. The kind of voice that didn't ask to be heard, but made itself heard simply by existing. "I've worn a crucifix every day since 1972, the man said, his voice carrying through the quiet like a slow drumbeat. "No one's ever said a damn word about it." Karen turned startled, as if someone had broken rank. Jasmine didn't move, didn't look away. The man leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He was older, mid-70s, his hands rough, his jacket neat but worn at the elbows. His hair was cut military short, white with age. And around his neck, partly visible beneath the collar of his shirt, was a silver cross, slightly larger than Jasmine's, shining with the kind of wear that told stories without a single word spoken. "But I'm not black," he added, eyes fixed on Karen. "So I guess that's the difference." The air shifted, sharply, instantly. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they cut through the illusion that had been holding the scene together. That this was about policy, that this was about protocol, that this was about anything but what it truly was, the discomfort of power when faced with presence. Karen stiffened. Her face flushed in real time. Not bright red. She was too well trained for that. But a thin, unmistakable line of color crawled along her cheekbones. She opened her mouth to speak, but the cabin was no longer listening to her. Jasmine turned her head slowly toward the man. Their eyes met. She gave a single nod. Not of gratitude, but of acknowledgement. Like two veterans passing in the same trench. More motion, subtle but growing. Across the aisle, a woman in business attire gently lowered her tablet and reached slowly for her phone. A passenger 2 rows behind leaned forward slightly, pretending to adjust his overhead vent, but his phone camera was already recording. The glow from the screen lit his face in blue. The moment was changing shape, becoming something else. Not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. Karen felt it. The shift, the control she had counted on, the quiet compliance, the invisible authority, was slipping. Not with confrontation, but with exposure. She could feel it in the way no one spoke, in the sudden stillness of her crew standing further back in the galley, uncertain now, waiting, watching. This was no longer a service issue. It was a moment, and she no longer owned it. Her throat tightened. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than she intended, but clipped. "Sir, this isn't a matter of race." The man held up a hand, gently but firmly, and shook his head. "It always is," he said, "when you pretend it's not." Then he sat back, unbothered, arms folded, his cross now visible in full view, as if daring her to say something about it. Karen stood frozen. She could feel every eye on her now, not openly, not accusing, but aware. And that was worse. Judgment could be deflected, outrage could be defended. But awareness? That was a mirror, and she couldn't look away. Her gaze drifted back to Jasmine, still seated, still silent, still wearing the same silver cross she'd worn when this began. But everything had changed. Not the symbol, not the seat, but the ground beneath them. Because now the cabin wasn't wondering if Jasmine belonged. They were wondering why Karen had made it a question in the first place. Karen stood like someone caught in a spotlight that wasn't supposed to find her. Her back was straight, but her jaw was clenched now. The passengers weren't speaking, but they were watching, and that kind of silence could swallow even the most polished authority whole. Jasmine hadn't moved, not even a millimeter. Mr. Williams sat steady as a monument, his cross still visible, his point already made. But the weight in the air was growing too large for the space, too full of what hadn't been said, too thick with what everyone had just seen. And then from the front of the cabin came a sound more arresting than any voice, the hiss of the cockpit door unlocking. It opened slowly, not in a rush, but like someone who understood timing, someone who entered a room only when absolutely necessary. Captain Douglas stepped out. He moved like a man who had spent his life trusting silence more than noise. 61 years old, tall, solid, deliberate in every motion. His hair was clipped short, silver fading into white at the temples. His face was lined, but his eyes were sharp, blue steel beneath heavy brows. The bars on his shoulders gleamed faintly under the cabin lights, and he wore them the way a soldier wears scars, with familiarity, not pride. The name stitched on his jacket read, De Morales Douglas. For 25 years, he had flown commercial jets. Before that, he flew C-130s over sand and fire during the Gulf War. He'd seen smoke rising over Baghdad. He'd heard prayers said through broken teeth. He had buried comrades with dog tags in one hand and a cross in the other. He knew the weight of belief, and he knew the cost of being stripped of it. His eyes moved once across the cabin, slowly taking in everything. Jasmine, Karen, Mr. William. The other passengers watching, but pretending not to. He didn't speak right away. He just stood. And in that standing, everything else paused. Karen turned toward him, clearing her throat as if that might reset the moment. "Captain," she said carefully, "I was just addressing a concern." He held up a hand, not rude, not loud, just enough. It was the kind of gesture that didn't invite argument. It ended it. Karen fell silent. Captain Douglas turned his gaze to Jasmine, not to study her, not to judge, just to see. His eyes lowered briefly to the crucifix resting against her chest. His expression didn't change. If anything, it softened. He took a single step closer, not imposing, just enough to close the distance without crowding it. His voice, when it came, was quiet. Not because it lacked strength, but because it didn't need volume. "I've watched good men fall apart when they had nothing left to believe in." The words landed slowly, each one deliberate, like someone laying bricks. "In the desert," he continued, "when the sky turns white and the ground is shaking, and there's no sound but your heartbeat and mortar fire, faith is the only thing left." The cabin was still, not a whisper, not a clink of silverware. He looked at Jasmine, nodding once, not in approval, but in recognition. "If that cross helped you survive something," he said, "you wear it. You keep it right where it is." Jasmine didn't speak. Her eyes didn't blink. But there was something in the set of her shoulders now, an ease, a lowering of a weight she hadn't acknowledged out loud. For the first time since the confrontation began, she wasn't holding the moment alone. Captain Douglas turned slightly, letting his eyes sweep the rest of the cabin, not with challenge, but clarity. Then his voice shifted, and this time it carried, not shouted, but broadcast, unmistakable. "And if someone in this cabin feels uncomfortable because another human being chooses to wear something that gave them hope in hell," he let that question hang in the air, then answered it himself, "then maybe they're not ready to live in the real world." A beat passed. Not one person objected. He nodded once more, just slightly to Jasmine, then turned and walked back toward the cockpit. Calm, steady, like nothing more needed to be said, and for a moment it felt like nothing ever had. The cabin door whispered shut behind her, but the silence in the crew rest area was deafening. Karen didn't walk. She collapsed into the narrow bench tucked beside the emergency gear cabinet, the hum of the aircraft doing nothing to quiet the roar inside her own head. Her breath caught in her chest. She had performed thousands of times, check the jacket, fix the smile, control the tone. But this time, she hadn't performed. Not really. This time she had reacted, and now she felt every inch of it unraveling. The overhead light buzzed faintly above her as she sat in the confined space. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, fingers laced tightly enough to turn her knuckles white. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened metal of the storage drawer. Sharp uniform, tight bun, lipstick perfectly intact. But the eyes were wrong, wide, glassy, distant. Her spine remained straight out of habit, but everything else was coming undone in slow motion. She'd meant to de-escalate, hadn't she? That's what she told herself. That's what she'd tell the crew. But the truth, it was growing louder than the script. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. She stared at it for several seconds before picking it up. No messages from crew, no alerts from operations. Just a swarm of notifications pouring in like a breach in a dam. A video, someone had filmed it. She knew even before she pressed play. The thumbnail alone was unmistakable. Her face mid-sentence, her hand gesturing toward Jasmine's crucifix. Her voice played in her own ears a second later. We ask our first-class passengers to kindly avoid displaying strong religious symbols. The words landed differently now, flat, plastic, empty. Her tone, measured, clipped, sounded exactly like what it was. Control masked as courtesy. Authority without humanity. Then came Jasmine's reply. Calm, devastating. This isn't a statement. It's what's left of me. Karen paused the video. She felt heat rise in her neck. But it wasn't just shame. It was exposure. Something primal. A cornered instinct realizing the mirror hadn't just been held up to her. It had been broadcast. Her voice, her expression, her bias. The internet would tear it apart in hours, maybe minutes. The headlines would write themselves. Flight attendant confronts passenger over cross. No context, no backstory. Just the frame, the clip, the echo. And maybe that's all it deserved to be. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she scrolled. Comment after comment. Thousands already. Some in defense, most not. Some were cruel. Some were measured. The worst weren't the insults. The worst were the quiet, disappointed ones. I've worked in hospitality for 19 years. You can hear it in her tone. She didn't attack, but you can feel the judgment bleeding through the smile. She didn't say it, but she said everything. Karen closed her eyes. In her mind, she wasn't the villain. She was the gatekeeper of order, the one who kept the space neutral, clean, controlled. But now that word, neutral, sounded cowardly, fragile. It wasn't that she had questioned a cross. She had questioned the person wearing it, and that realization hit harder than anything the comment section could throw at her. She remembered her mother's voice, soft, weary from long hours, waiting tables in Atlanta. Kindness isn't just what you say, it's what you choose not to show on your face. Back then, Karen didn't understand it. She thought kindness was in rules and tone. But now, sitting alone in the belly of a jet 30,000 feet in the air, she finally understood. Her failure hadn't been in the policy, it had been in the pause, the glance, the way her voice tightened around a cross worn by the wrong neck. She wanted to disappear, to crawl into a quiet place of excuses, but even her thoughts refused to let her hide. She remembered the way Jasmine looked at her, not angry, not afraid, just solid. Like someone who'd faced worse and didn't need Karen's approval to breathe. And that, perhaps, had been the final trigger. Karen had always equated calm with control, but Jasmine's calm had exposed control, revealed it for what it was, brittle. She leaned back against the wall of the compartment, staring upward now. The ceiling wasn't moving, but she felt motion sickness creeping in, not from turbulence, but from within. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure she deserved the uniform on her chest. Not because she had shouted, not because she had broken rules, but because she'd done everything by the book and still done harm. She didn't know what she would say to Jasmine, or if she'd even get the chance. But she knew one thing with painful clarity. Nothing about what had happened could be undone by a revised announcement or a company memo. This wasn't a training error. This was a failure of self-awareness. Outside the curtain, the cabin had returned to its curated hush. Reclined seats, soft jazz, ice clinking into glasses. But Karen sat behind it all, alone in the dark, the voice of a veteran captain still echoing in her mind. If that cross helped you survive something, you wear it. You keep it right where it is. And deeper still, Jasmine's quieter truth. You're not uncomfortable with the cross. You're uncomfortable with me wearing it. The curtain closed behind her with a soft hiss, but the noise in Karen's chest was deafening. Every step back toward the front of the cabin felt like walking through thick wind. The lights were dimmed, the passengers mostly quiet, the illusion of calm restored. But for her, nothing had settled. The cabin hadn't forgotten. She hadn't forgotten. The cross was still there. So was the silence. So was the mirror Jasmine had held up without ever raising her voice. Karen adjusted her collar, not to look presentable, just to feel her hands doing something real. She made her way down the aisle slowly, the overhead bins casting long, narrow shadows that seemed to follow her movement like ghosts. Her shoes tapped against the carpet softly. Soft, but not unnoticed. She could feel it, the flick of eyes from passengers who had seen too much already. Some watched openly, others pretended not to, but all of them knew. Jasmine was still in 1A. She sat exactly as she had before, upright, composed. Her book rested on her lap, closed now, fingers gently folded over it. She didn't shift, didn't lean back or forward, just watched as Karen approached, eyes clear, calm, unreadable. Not cold, just waiting, like someone who'd seen enough apologies to know most were for show. Karen stopped beside her row. She didn't crouch this time, didn't kneel. That wasn't what this moment needed. Instead, she stood tall, but with a weight pressing through her spine that had nothing to do with gravity. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, voice low but clear. "But I needed to say this." Jasmine didn't speak, not yet. Karen took a breath, but didn't look away. "I thought I was following policy," she said, "but the truth is, I was defending my own fear, my own image of what this cabin should look like. And when I saw you and that cross," she hesitated, not for words, for courage. "I didn't see you. I saw what I thought didn't belong, and I acted like it was my job to correct that. But it wasn't. It was my job to serve, with respect, with understanding. I failed at that." Jasmine's gaze didn't soften, but something shifted in the air between them. Karen continued, voice steadier now, not rehearsed, owned. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult you. But what I did hurt anyway, because I made you carry the burden of my discomfort." She swallowed. "And I'm sorry." A long pause followed. Then Jasmine leaned forward. Not much, just enough to close the space slightly. Her voice, when it came, was soft but so clear it seemed to quiet the rest of the cabin by its very presence. "Most people wait until they're caught to say what you just said." Karen flinched slightly. "But you came back." Another beat passed. Jasmine studied her, not with suspicion, but with practiced discernment, like someone who'd been offered empty apologies one too many times. "I don't need you to fall apart," she said. "I just need you to be better after this." Karen nodded once. It wasn't reflex. It was a promise she didn't know how to prove yet, but needed to. Jasmine looked down at the crucifix, gently touching her collarbone, then back up at Karen. "This isn't a weapon," she said. "It's a memory, and a shield." Karen's eyes welled slightly, not enough to cry, just enough to sting. "I see that now," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't before, but I do now." Jasmine gave a single measured nod. "I believe you." Nothing more, nothing less. And that was all that needed to be said. Karen stood there a second longer, not frozen, just human. Then she turned slowly, walking back down the aisle, not as the flight attendant reclaiming control, but as a woman who had finally let go of it. Behind her, Jasmine sat quietly in her seat. The crucifix stayed exactly where it had been from the start, and now no one dared to ask her to move it again. 1 month had passed, but the echo of that flight still lived in Jasmine's chest. Now as she stood in the wings of a TEDx stage beneath a bold red banner reading, "The Right to Presence," that moment, 35,000 feet in the air, a silver crucifix, a steady voice in a shifting room, was not behind her. It was within her. The auditorium lights were low, the air thick with the silence of attention. Dozens of rows of faces waited, eyes lifted, ready for something they didn't know they needed. Jasmine stepped forward. She didn't stride. She didn't command. She simply moved like she always had, calm, grounded, unafraid. A small microphone curved across her cheek. The crucifix still hung below her collarbone, silent, radiant. She stepped into the light, and the room leaned in. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but firm enough to silence doubt. A month ago, she began, I was asked to hide something I've worn since I was 17. No dramatic pause, just truth. Not because it was dangerous, not because it was against any rule, but because it made someone uncomfortable. A hush washed across the crowd, the kind of stillness that signals people are truly listening. It wasn't the symbol, she said. It was me. She let that land. What I wore was mistaken for defiance. What I carried was mistaken for threat. But what I was doing, what I've always done, and was survive. She looked up, locking eyes with no one and everyone. And I've learned that silence in the face of that kind of injustice is not neutrality. It's complicity. The audience didn't erupt. It held. The words weren't built for applause. They were built for truth. Jasmine took a step forward, not in performance, but in presence. When someone is asked to shrink so that others don't have to stretch, she continued, we are not maintaining peace. We are protecting power. A low breath moved through the crowd like a wave. I'm not here to shame anyone, she said, her tone still even, still composed. I'm here to tell you that we do not need to make ourselves smaller to be allowed into the room. She turned slightly, eyes scanning the people watching her. Corporate leaders, educators, students, strangers. Because presence is not a privilege, it's a birthright. The words rang clear and final. And every time we pretend not to see injustice, just to keep the room quiet, we're saying that comfort matters more than truth. Silence, then breath, then thunder. The applause began not with a roar, but with a single clap that multiplied. A wave of hands, not for performance, but for resonance. People stood. Some wiped tears. Some held them in. Jasmine remained still, her body calm even as the crowd rose. She didn't bow. She didn't smile wide. She simply nodded once, with the quiet strength of someone who had finally said out loud what generations before her had only dared to think. The event moved on, as events do. New speakers, new stories. But the air in the room had changed. Afterward, in the backstage lounge where attendees mingled, thanked, asked for photos or signed programs, Jasmine stood near a small table with a glass of water in her hand, quietly absorbing the room again. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't trying to be. She was just present, fully, unapologetically. That was enough. Then she saw her, across the room, dressed not in uniform but in a simple navy blazer and slacks, stood Karen. Hair down, no clipboard, no performance. She stood with her hands loosely clasped in front of her, hesitant at the edges of the space. A woman debating whether she deserved to walk through it. Their eyes met. Karen stepped forward slowly. She didn't rush. She didn't rehearse. She looked like someone who had carried 30 days of reckoning on her back and wasn't sure how to put it down. She stopped a few feet away. No crowd, no phones, just the two of them. Karen took a shallow breath. You showed me something, she said quietly. Something I didn't know I was hiding behind. Jasmine said nothing, waiting. Karen's voice didn't tremble, but it didn't pretend to be strong either. Sometimes rules, she began, then paused as if finding the real shape of the thought. Sometimes rules are just a shell we put around our fear, and we call it professionalism, or policy, or safety. She met Jasmine's gaze, not trying to earn anything, just trying to be honest. But really, I think I was just scared of being wrong, of what I didn't understand. She stopped there. That was all she had. Jasmine's expression didn't shift right away. But then slowly, she smiled. Not the kind that forgave, the kind that understood. If you're still carrying that fear, she said, voice gentle but resolute, don't hide it. A pause, then the softest lift of her chin. Walk through it. Karen nodded once, and something in her shoulders lowered, like a weight shifting from shame into something else. Not relief, not closure, but beginning. Jasmine turned back to the room, her glass still in hand. The light from the TEDx letters behind her painted a soft glow across her shoulders. The conversation was over, but its echo would last far beyond the walls of that stage. Because in that moment, two women had chosen presence over perfection, and somewhere in the crowd, someone else now believed they could do the same. Karen had always loved the silence of a pre-flight cabin, the hum of powered systems, the low thrum of oxygen recycling through filtered vents, the muted shuffle of early boarders. But the silence she stepped into now, her first flight back, wasn't comforting. It was conscious, and she carried it like a second skin. It had been 6 weeks since the flight that changed her. 6 weeks since she'd spoken words she thought were policy, but learned were judgment. 6 weeks since her reflection had stopped looking like someone who simply followed rules and started looking like someone who used them to hide fear. The airline hadn't suspended her. Officially, it was time for internal reflection, but she knew what it was: a pause, a reckoning, a quiet, necessary exile. Now she was back. The uniform still fit, the scarf still wrapped neatly at her collar, the wings still pinned above her heart. But everything beneath had shifted. Her posture was humbler, not bent, just quieter. She walked the jet bridge like someone entering a familiar place with unfamiliar eyes. And for the first time in her career, she didn't walk in like she owned the aisle. She walked in like she respected it. Pre-boarding passed without incident. She smiled at a young father carrying a sleeping toddler. She knelt beside an older woman who needed help with her belt clasp, asking gently, "Is that too tight?" A question she'd never asked before. And when a man stepped into first class with a Sikh turban, briefcase in one hand, and a soft gold khanda around his neck, Karen's gaze met his, not with curiosity, but with warmth. Not performance. Practice. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said, voice calm. "Please let me know if you need anything at all." He nodded, and for a moment, the world didn't shift. But Karen did. She returned to the galley with no fanfare, pouring drinks and running final safety checks. But every task carried intention. Not mechanical efficiency, human weight. She remembered every face that had gone unnoticed before, every detail she used to miss. Halfway through the flight, she stood quietly near row 4, assisting with a service request when a young woman, no older than 20, stopped her mid-sentence. She wore a soft green hijab, the corners tucked neatly behind her ears, and a name tag from a college lanyard that read, "Engineering Student, Georgia Tech. "I just wanted to say," the girl said, her voice almost a whisper, "I saw that video." Karen blinked. "You were in it, right? With Ms. Crockett?" Karen hesitated, then nodded. The girl smiled, small and sincere. "I thought it would be ugly, but it wasn't. It was honest. Thank you for coming back from that." Karen exhaled slowly. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, her voice lower than she expected. "I've learned that fixing something doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it's just doing better. Every single day." The girl nodded. "Well, you are." Karen smiled gently, then stepped back toward the galley. She didn't cry, but her chest ached in the way it does when a burden shifts. Not gone, just no longer carried alone. That night, she filled out her post-flight report. She listed the usual notes: turbulence moderate, service smooth, one child with an allergy to peanuts. But then, in the open comments section, she added something she'd never written before. Cabin energy respectful. Passengers diverse. Everyone showed up. So did I. And she meant every word. Karen didn't change the world that day, but she returned to it, and she chose to walk through it differently. Every day forward. Every aisle walked, every seat approached, every assumption paused before it formed, would be part of her new way of flying. Not to escape altitude, but to find perspective. It was early morning, not yet dawn. The city was still cloaked in that pale blue silence that comes before the world wakes. Jasmine sat by the window of her modest apartment, barefoot, a half-drunk cup of tea cooling beside her on the table. The light was low, not dim from lack of power, but deliberate. The kind of light you sit in when you don't want to be distracted by anything other than your own thoughts. The crucifix still hung around her neck. It was lighter now, not physically, but spiritually. For the first time in years, it no longer felt like a burden disguised as protection. It felt like presence, like memory, like something that had been witnessed, finally, for what it truly was. She opened her journal, not the one she used for work, the leather one, the one with dog-eared pages and water stains from too many flights, too many cities, the one she didn't carry into courtrooms or interviews, but always kept in her suitcase anyway. She turned to a fresh page, dated it quietly, no drama, just truth, and began to write. Not to anyone, not to the world, just to the silence. Some moments never leave you, not because they were traumatic or loud or devastating, but because they revealed something so true you could never unsee it. On that flight, I wasn't afraid. Not really. I was tired. Tired of being asked to explain, to soften, to excuse my right to be whole in a space designed to question it. I've stood before juries. I've walked through courthouses where my heels echoed like threats. I've held mothers whose sons didn't get the chance to grow into men. I've buried my voice in policy, in professionalism, in patience. But that moment, that small, quiet, barely confrontational moment, it cracked something open. Not rage, recognition of how easily power dresses itself in politeness, of how deeply we've all been trained to accept it. She paused, tapping the pen against the table once, then continued. Karen wasn't a villain. She was just early in the work. And I could see it. The flicker in her eye when control stopped working. The look of someone watching a mask slip off their own face. I didn't forgive her in the moment because I'm saintly. I forgave her because I remembered. I remembered when I used to think power was the loudest voice. When I thought making people comfortable meant I was doing well. She didn't harm me with malice. She harmed me with assumption. But she came back. And that, maybe more than anything, was the real beginning. Outside the window, the city started to stretch. A few cars hummed past. A jogger in a neon vest. The sky softened from navy to silver. Jasmine set the pen down. She didn't sign the page. She didn't need to. It wasn't a letter meant to be mailed or framed or even shared. It was a letter of witness to the moment, to the scar, to the survival. She folded the page gently, slipped it into the inner pocket of her journal, next to a faded photograph of her mother and a sermon note written on the back of a napkin. Then she closed the book. She sat still for a moment longer, one hand resting over the journal, the other at her collar, thumb brushing lightly over the edge of the cross. She wasn't preparing for a speech. She wasn't gearing up for a fight. She was simply being present, with herself, with her truth, with the quiet, small act of remembering and not flinching. That morning, she didn't post a quote online. She didn't write a new piece. She didn't respond to the latest comment about the video. Instead, she brewed a fresh cup of tea. She watered her plant. And when she left the apartment, the crucifix still hung where it always had, above her heart, quiet but visible. Not to provoke, not to perform, just to say, I'm still here. As Jasmine gently closed the worn leather journal, a quiet yet profound silence filled the room, one that invited reflection. Outside, the morning city hummed steadily to life, oblivious to the weight of Jasmine's quiet revelations. Yet within these four walls, her truths vibrated powerfully, echoing lessons far greater than her own story. This was no longer just about Jasmine and Karen or a single flight. It was about something deeper, more universal, the unspoken complicity of silence, the quiet oppression of conformity, and the strength it took to defy both. Her experiences had become symbolic, a lens through which countless others could finally see themselves. This moment was not an end, but a beginning, a turning point, inviting those who watched, listened, and understood to step beyond fear and into authenticity. In the aftermath of Jasmine's TEDx talk, the conversation ignited by that 20-second video became unstoppable. People who had once accepted discrimination quietly began speaking up, recognizing their own silence as a kind of consent. Social media posts transitioned into living room dialogues. Uncomfortable truths were now openly discussed at kitchen tables, workplaces, and in classrooms. Teachers, nurses, executives, ordinary individuals who had once chosen neutrality suddenly felt compelled to stand firmly beside those who were marginalized. Jasmine's words had illuminated an uncomfortable yet essential truth. Neutrality in the face of injustice was simply injustice disguised as politeness. The message had transcended Jasmine herself, becoming an urgent reminder of society's collective responsibility. The cross she wore, symbolic of her own survival and resilience, had become a universal emblem of courage, authenticity, and strength in vulnerability. Meanwhile, Karen's journey was equally profound, though quieter. Back at work, every interaction was now infused with mindfulness and genuine care. It wasn't an overnight transformation, nor a performance meant for redemption. It was something deeper, an awakening. Karen no longer saw policy as a rigid wall, but as a guideline subject to empathy, context, and compassion. She finally understood that behind every guideline, behind every rule, were real lives, real emotions, and very real fears. Her interactions became meaningful exchanges instead of scripted transactions. And though she knew she could never fully erase the damage she had once inadvertently caused, she now saw clearly how to contribute meaningfully to its healing. Every small gesture of kindness, every gentle acknowledgement of someone's dignity, became her quiet rebellion against the fear she had once harbored. Yet the greatest lesson transcended both Jasmine and Karen. It belonged to the world watching them. It was about the invisible barriers built by assumptions, about how easily silence can become a prison. The injustice Jasmine faced wasn't overtly violent, but quietly pervasive, wrapped neatly in politeness, hidden beneath layers of subtle expectation. This subtlety was its most dangerous feature. Discrimination that doesn't shout rarely faces confrontation. Jasmine's gentle refusal to conform had forced everyone watching to question the hidden prejudices they carried. Her calm confrontation and Karen's subsequent awakening had exposed the fragile, uncomfortable truth that societal biases live silently within us all. Jasmine's courage reminded us that confronting injustice doesn't always require anger or outrage. Often it simply requires unwavering presence. Through Jasmine's courage and Karen's introspection, the story revealed the critical importance of listening deeply and speaking honestly. Real conversations, uncomfortable, honest, and transparent, were now being had. From boardrooms to churches, people began acknowledging their own complicity, understanding that silence was not safety, but an endorsement of oppression. Jasmine had shown clearly that sometimes presence alone could be revolutionary. Showing up authentically, visibly, without apology, wasn't simply an act of personal liberation. It was an invitation for others to step bravely into their own truth. The lesson was stark yet hopeful. Humanity thrives not in uniformity, but in the acknowledgement and celebration of difference. But the story did not promise easy redemption or instant change. It emphasized that genuine transformation requires continuous, conscious effort. Karen's return to the skies wasn't marked by grand gestures, but by quiet, consistent commitment. Jasmine's continued advocacy wasn't about spotlight or accolades. It was about planting seeds of consciousness wherever she went. They both understood deeply now that creating a just, compassionate world is never finished. It is ongoing work. It requires humility, accountability, and the willingness to stand alone when necessary. These women had faced a difficult truth head-on, and in doing so, illuminated a path forward for countless others, still trapped behind silence, prejudice, or fear. For those who followed their story online, on television, or through whispered retellings at work and home, it became a symbol of hope and possibility. It illustrated how change often begins quietly, with a single moment of refusal to accept the unacceptable. Jasmine's refusal wasn't loud, aggressive, or confrontational. It was simply firm. Karen's subsequent reckoning wasn't dramatic or performative. It was genuine, deeply reflective, and painfully honest. Together, they demonstrated how transformative even a single moment of sincere, courageous humanity could be. The message spread rapidly, crossing borders, cultures, and generations, reminding millions that standing up against injustice doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means simply refusing to sit silently when someone is asked unfairly to disappear. At its core, this was a story of human dignity. Jasmine didn't demand special treatment, recognition, or praise. She asked only for respect, authenticity, and the freedom to exist unapologetically as herself. Karen learned through painful self-reflection that dignity is not granted but inherently deserved by everyone. The clash between these two women, brief and uncomfortable though it had been, had sparked a powerful global conversation about belonging, empathy, and accountability. It taught that discrimination often arrives disguised in manners and protocol, but is always recognizable by its fundamental refusal to acknowledge someone's humanity fully. As weeks passed, Jasmine began receiving letters from around the world. She kept them safely, reading each one carefully, feeling humbled by how deeply her words had resonated. Letters came from places she had never visited, from villages in India, schools in Nigeria, small towns in the American Midwest. They all said variations of the same thing. Her courage had given them language, had given them strength. One letter from a young man in rural Tennessee simply read, "You made me brave enough to show my true self to my family. Thank you for making me realize my existence matters." Jasmine understood fully then that this story had grown far beyond herself, becoming an anthem for those still fighting unseen battles. In Karen's world, the quiet changes continued daily. She'd become known for gentle bravery, standing up subtly yet firmly in meetings, during flights, in quiet conversations with colleagues. Once, when another flight attendant hesitated over letting a passenger board while wearing a prominent religious symbol, Karen stepped forward and softly said, "It's okay. It matters to her. It doesn't harm anyone else." Her colleague nodded slowly, understanding. Karen realized that each day was a series of small decisions, each moment an opportunity to choose understanding over fear. As their story continued to inspire others, both Jasmine and Karen understood a deeper, shared truth. Humanity's most profound growth often arises from discomfort. Painful conversations, quiet courage, sincere reflection, all were necessary ingredients for meaningful change. They had both witnessed firsthand that staying silent in moments of injustice was never neutrality, but rather an endorsement of harm. Their experiences taught the world that courage is rarely loud or dramatic. Often it's quiet, steady, persistent, and brave enough to stand alone. Ultimately, the greatest lesson from their journey was the simplest yet the hardest to embody. True humanity requires seeing others fully and clearly, without expectation or judgment. It means choosing empathy even when it's easier to remain comfortably indifferent. Jasmine and Karen's intertwined stories illuminated a universal truth, that each of us holds the power to either perpetuate injustice through silence or dismantle it through brave, authentic presence. Their message was now clear, echoing in every heart touched by their story. Presence, dignity, and authenticity are not negotiable rights reserved for a few. They are human rights owed to everyone. For those who followed their story online, on television, or through whispered retellings at work and home, it became a symbol of hope and possibility. It illustrated how change often begins quietly, with a single moment of refusal to accept the unacceptable. Jasmine's refusal wasn't loud, aggressive, or confrontational. It was simply firm. Karen's subsequent reckoning wasn't dramatic or performative. It was genuine, deeply reflective, and painfully honest. Together, they demonstrated how transformative even a single moment of sincere, courageous humanity could be. The message spread rapidly, crossing borders, cultures, and generations, reminding millions that standing up against injustice doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means simply refusing to sit silently when someone is asked unfairly to disappear. At its core, this was a story of human dignity. Jasmine didn't demand special treatment, recognition, or praise. She asked only for respect, authenticity, and the freedom to exist unapologetically as herself. Karen learned through painful self-reflection that dignity is not granted, but inherently deserved by everyone. The clash between these two women, brief and uncomfortable though it had been, had sparked a powerful global conversation about belonging, empathy, and accountability. It taught that discrimination often arrives disguised in manners and protocol, but is always recognizable by its fundamental refusal to acknowledge someone's humanity fully. As weeks passed, Jasmine began receiving letters from around the world. She kept them safely, reading each one carefully, feeling humbled by how deeply her words had resonated. Letters came from places she had never visited, from villages in India, schools in Nigeria, small towns in the American Midwest. They all said variations of the same thing. Her courage had given them language, had given them strength. One letter from a young man in rural Tennessee simply read, "You made me brave enough to show my true self to my family. Thank you for making me realize my existence matters." Jasmine understood fully then that this story had grown far beyond herself, becoming an anthem for those still fighting unseen battles. In Karen's world, the quiet changes continued daily. She'd become known for gentle bravery, standing up subtly yet firmly in meetings, during flights, in quiet conversations with colleagues. Once, when another flight attendant hesitated over letting a passenger board while wearing a prominent religious symbol, Karen stepped forward and softly said, "It's okay. It matters to her. It doesn't harm anyone else." Her colleague nodded slowly, understanding. Karen realized that each day was a series of small decisions, each moment an opportunity to choose understanding over fear. As their story continued to inspire others, both Jasmine and Karen understood a deeper, shared truth. Humanity's most profound growth often arises from discomfort. Painful conversations, quiet courage, sincere reflection, all were necessary ingredients for meaningful change. They had both witnessed firsthand that staying silent in moments of injustice was never neutrality, but rather an endorsement of harm. Their experiences taught the world that courage is rarely loud or dramatic. Often it's quiet, steady, persistent, and brave enough to stand alone. Ultimately, the greatest lesson from their journey was the simplest, yet the hardest to embody. True humanity requires seeing others fully and clearly, without expectation or judgment. It means choosing empathy even when it's easier to remain comfortably indifferent. Jasmine and Karen's intertwined stories illuminated a universal truth, that each of us holds the power to either perpetuate injustice through silence or dismantle it through brave, authentic presence. Their message was now clear, echoing in every heart touched by their story. Presence, dignity, and authenticity are not negotiable rights reserved for a few. They are human rights owed to everyone. On a flight to Texas, Jasmine Crockett, a young attorney, unexpectedly gave up her first-class seat for an elderly veteran sitting in economy. She had no idea that 30 years earlier, her own father had saved this very man when he was homeless after the war. The entire cabin fell silent. Some passengers were moved to tears. If you stood before a stranger and suddenly realized he carried the memory of your father, what would you do? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett, a well-known attorney from Texas, sat quietly in first class, focused and composed. She wore a simple black suit, elegant, professional, no frills. A thick folder rested on her lap, filled with notes for an upcoming political event. Her wireless earbuds played softly, a calm voice going over key talking points. She flipped pages slowly, highlighting lines here and there, fully immersed in her work. Around her, passengers settled in, but she barely noticed. This was her routine. Prepare, stay ready, stay sharp. The cabin buzzed with soft conversation and clinking glasses, but Jasmine remained in her own quiet space, steady and thoughtful. While Jasmine Crockett stayed focused up front, tuned into policy notes and plans for change, something quieter, yet heavier, was unfolding at the very back of the plane. An older man stepped into the cabin with slow, uneven steps. He didn't draw attention, but there was something about the way he moved, like each step had weight. His shoulders slumped slightly, his right leg dragged just a bit, and he kept one hand gripping the overhead bin as he walked, steadying himself. His jacket was old military issue, faded at the seams, the color somewhere between green and gray now. A bronze star medal was pinned just above the pocket, and below it, a stitched patch read simply, "Afghanistan Veteran." He held a soft leather bag in his other hand, worn thin at the corners, the handle taped where it had started to tear. He looked for his seat without saying a word, glancing down the row numbers, never rushing. Most people didn't notice. A few glanced up, then away. He didn't expect anything else. When he finally reached row 29, he let out a breath and eased down into the middle seat. It took effort. His knees bumped the seat in front, and he winced as he adjusted, trying not to touch anyone. The man next to him, maybe in his 40s, well-dressed in a blazer and dress shirt, gave a quick side glance and shook his head. He closed his laptop hard, loud enough for the row to hear. Then he sighed, not subtle, not quiet. The old man turned his head slightly. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "Am I in your way?" The man shrugged, not looking at him. "You're moving a lot," he said flatly. "Kinda hard to get work done like this." "Oh, I didn't mean to. I'll try to stay still," the old man replied, voice low, calm. The man gave a small laugh under his breath. "Yeah, it's just not great when you're packed in like this, you know?" The veteran didn't respond. He just nodded and looked down at his lap. His hands rested quietly on his knees. After a second, he reached down, pulled his bag closer to his feet, and pressed himself back against the seat as if trying to take up less space. The businessman went back to typing, not another word. Around them, a few passengers heard it. One woman frowned. Another man glanced over, then turned away. No one spoke. It wasn't loud enough to cause a scene, but it was loud enough to cut. The veteran didn't ask for anything. He didn't complain. He just sat there, quietly shrinking into his seat, trying not to be a problem. Far ahead in first class, Jasmine Crockett remained unaware, flipping to the next page of her binder, eyes landing on a line she'd highlighted earlier. Every veteran deserves respect, not just in uniform, but in everyday life. The story was already starting. No one knew it yet. The businessman shifted again, jaw clenched, fingers tapping against his armrest like he was barely holding something in. Then, without warning, his voice rose above the low hum of the cabin. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough that half the row looked up. He gave a sharp glance at the veteran beside him, then leaned slightly forward, speaking louder this time. "Nobody made this guy get on the plane. He's not helpless. He's not owed anything here." The words weren't shouted, but they were cold, clear, and loud enough to cut through conversation, earbuds, and the click of seatbelt buckles. He laughed dryly, looking around as if waiting for someone to back him up. "I've got reports to finish and meetings tonight. I'm sorry, but if you can't sit still for a 2-hour flight, maybe you take the bus next time, or wait for the senior shuttle. Something that fits better." A man in the row ahead turned slightly in his seat. A woman diagonally behind them stopped mid-sentence. No one said a word, not yet. The veteran, still looking straight ahead, blinked slowly. His jaw moved once, tightening, then relaxing, as if he was measuring whether a response was worth it. After a beat, he said softly, "I didn't mean to get in your way." His voice wasn't weak, but it was small, controlled. He didn't look at the man when he said it. "Oh, it's not just me," the businessman replied quickly, spreading his arms like he was speaking on behalf of the whole cabin. "Everybody around us is dealing with it. You're bumping into me. Your bag's half under my feet. This just isn't the right place for someone who needs extra attention." The old man didn't answer. He slowly reached down, pulled his bag even closer toward himself, and rested his hands on top of it like he was shielding something fragile. His face gave nothing away, but something in the way he breathed, a long, silent exhale, said more than any comeback ever could. That's when the flight attendant approached. She'd seen enough passengers freeze to know when something was wrong. Early 30s, steady but tired, her smile tried to hide concern. She crouched slightly next to the row, her voice low but audible. "Hi there, just checking in. Is everything all right?" The businessman spoke before anyone else could. "We're fine," he said curtly. "Just a little tight back here. I'm trying to work. He's moving around a lot." She turned to the veteran, gentle. "Sir, are you okay?" He looked up briefly, his eyes dull but polite. "Yes, ma'am, I'm all right. I'm sorry if I'm making trouble." The words hit her wrong. She smiled, but it faltered. "You're not causing any trouble," she said, then glanced at the businessman again, who was already reopening his laptop. The attendant paused, just for a second, then rose and stepped away, unsure what else to do. Technically, no rule had been broken, but something had absolutely been violated. Back in his seat, the old man shifted just slightly toward the window, keeping his back to the aisle. He didn't pull out a book. He didn't ask for anything. He just looked out at the clouds beyond the glass and blinked. And still no one spoke. Not the man across the aisle who'd heard everything. Not the couple in row 28 who exchanged worried glances but said nothing. Not the mother a few rows up who had already told her son to lower his voice earlier, but stayed silent now. Everyone heard it, and everyone let it happen. Because the cruelty hadn't come in shouting or swearing, it came dressed in civility, camouflaged in, "I'm just being honest," and "I'm just saying what others think." And the man on the receiving end, who'd once worn a uniform, who'd been trained to lead under fire, to risk his life without question, now sat in silence, shrinking, like he'd committed some unseen crime just by aging. She hadn't meant to listen. At first, she was still focused, skimming through policy notes, nodding along to a podcast in one ear. But something had shifted in the atmosphere behind her, something brittle, ugly, wrong. The tone of the man's voice, the way he said, "people like him," the silence that followed, it cracked through the drone of the engines like ice underfoot. Jasmine paused, one hand frozen on a yellow highlighter, her body suddenly still. She slowly removed her earbud, the soft voice of the podcast fading out, replaced by the uncomfortable quiet of a cabin pretending nothing happened. She turned slightly in her seat, peering down the narrow aisle, catching only glimpses, shoulders stiff with tension, a businessman hunched over a glowing laptop, and a thin, quiet figure staring out the window unmoving. She didn't need to hear more. She already knew. She had seen that exact look before, in courtrooms, at shelters, across from men who'd survived war, but were still losing battles in their own country. Her chest tightened, not with outrage, but with something colder. Resolve. Without a word, Jasmine leaned forward and pressed the call button. Her movement was calm, but there was steel behind it. The soft chime echoed above her like a warning shot. The flight attendant appeared at Jasmine's side just seconds after the call button chimed, still a bit breathless from walking the aisle. She leaned in politely, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her notepad tucked under one arm. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, offering a customer service smile. Her voice was neutral, expecting something routine. A drink request, a question about connecting Wi-Fi, maybe a complaint about the air conditioning. But Jasmine Crockett didn't smile back. She didn't frown either. She just looked up with a steady calm that made the young woman's expression falter. There was something different in Jasmine's eyes. Not anger, not frustration, but a kind of firm stillness, a line drawn in silence. "I'd like to give up my seat," Jasmine said, her voice level and clear. The attendant blinked once, confused. "I'm sorry?" Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her tone unwavering. "I want to switch seats with the man sitting at the back. The older gentleman, the one in the military jacket." The attendant stared at her for a moment. "You mean, you want him to sit here?" Her voice wavered slightly. Not out of judgment, just surprise. "Yes," Jasmine said simply. "I heard what was said to him. He doesn't deserve that. He shouldn't be back there, crammed against the wall beside someone who sees him as a nuisance. He should be here, in a seat with dignity." There was a pause, not long, but thick with weight. The hum of the engine, steady and low, filled the silence as the flight attendant tried to piece together what she was hearing. She looked around instinctively, as if hoping someone else would confirm what her ears had just taken in. Then she looked back at Jasmine, eyes scanning her face. "You're sure?" she asked softly. "This is your seat. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Jasmine replied, her voice soft but edged with steel. "That's why it matters." There was no performance in her tone, no theatrics, no self-righteousness, just clarity, the kind that doesn't need to explain itself. The attendant didn't answer right away. She glanced back toward the cabin, then gave a slow, almost reverent nod. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll go speak with him." She turned and walked briskly down the aisle, but her posture had changed. She was no longer just a uniform delivering service. She was carrying something larger now, A message, a gesture, a choice someone else had made, but that she now felt part of. As she disappeared toward the rear of the plane, the atmosphere around Jasmine shifted. Subtle at first, like ripples from a single drop in still water. A man across the aisle lowered his tablet, his brow furrowed. He looked at Jasmine, then back down the aisle, lips pressed together. 2 rows ahead, a woman who had been flipping through a magazine stopped mid-turn and slowly leaned toward her partner. "Did she say she's giving up her seat?" she whispered. Behind Jasmine, a teenage girl had taken out one earbud and was now sitting forward, watching closely. Another passenger nearby pulled out his phone and held it low in his hand, the screen glowing, recording silently. Jasmine heard the murmurs, the shifting bodies, the change in the air. But she didn't react. She reached up, calm and deliberate, opened the overhead bin, and retrieved her carry-on bag. No hesitation, no dramatic sigh, just quiet, efficient movement. She placed the bag gently on the floor beside her feet, then sat back down, hands folded on her lap, eyes forward, expression unreadable. There was nothing casual about what she had just done, and yet she carried it like it was no big deal. But everyone around her knew it was. It wasn't just generosity. It wasn't just kindness. It was a correction, a small, precise answer to something wrong that had happened only minutes ago. A response not made in anger, but in principle, and it had landed like a drop of ink in water, spreading fast and silent. "She doesn't even know him," someone whispered from the row behind her. "Did he ask her for it?" someone else muttered. "No," another voice answered. "She just offered." That "just" hung in the air, as if they were trying to understand how such a thing could be so simple and yet feel so monumental. Jasmine stayed still, letting the buzz rise and fall around her. She wasn't waiting for applause. She wasn't interested in stares. She was simply present, in her conviction, in her skin, in her power. And somewhere behind her, the attendant was reaching row 29, crouching down beside the man in the military jacket to tell him what had just happened. But up here, in first class, the balance had already shifted. The flight attendant's words had just left her lips when the old man slowly looked up. His eyes filled not with surprise but with discomfort. Not from the offer itself, but from the idea that someone believed he was worth it. "No, no, that's not necessary," he said gently, shaking his head. His voice was steady but low, the kind of tone people use when they've learned not to ask for much. "She's in first class. She earned that seat. I'm fine back here." His hand rested on his bag like it was a barrier, something that would anchor him where he felt he belonged. "Don't trouble her on my account," he added, offering a polite, almost apologetic smile, like he was the one inconveniencing everyone. Around them, a few passengers looked over again, some with curiosity, some with guilt, but no one said a word. It was Jasmine's voice that broke the silence next, calm but direct, spoken with a certainty that made heads turn again. "It's not trouble," she said, stepping closer. "It's a choice. Mine." Her tone wasn't emotional, but it didn't need to be. It carried something heavier, conviction. The veteran shook his head again, eyes soft but unsure. "Ma'am, I appreciate it, really, but I don't need special treatment." Jasmine met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "This isn't about special treatment," she said. "It's about basic decency. And right now, sitting next to someone who treated you like you're a burden, that's not decent." She paused, then added, "You shouldn't have to shrink just to keep others comfortable. That's not your job." He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes something flickered. Not pride, not resistance, but quiet recognition. Like part of him had waited years for someone to say exactly that. He nodded slowly. "If you're sure." "I'm sure," she said. The attendant reached down and helped him with his bag. Jasmine stepped aside, letting him move past her with dignity, not assistance. As he began walking toward the front of the plane, people shifted in their seats to make way. This time, no one looked away. Jasmine didn't watch him go. She turned back toward the rear, her expression unreadable but resolved. The aisle seemed longer now, narrower, lined with the quiet tension that comes after something irreversible. As she walked, passengers parted like water around her. Some gave a nod, others didn't dare meet her eyes. She didn't care. She reached row 29 and stood beside the now empty seat, the same cramped space where the veteran had been pressed against the window like an afterthought. The man in the business suit still sat in the aisle seat, face lit by the glow of his laptop. He didn't look up. Not at her, not at anyone. His fingers tapped at keys that weren't being read, weren't being sent. His attention was a performance. Jasmine knew it. She slid into the middle seat beside him. No sigh, no rustle, no complaint. Just presence. Her knees barely fit. The armrest dug into her side. The cabin air was stale, faintly metallic, but she didn't shift. She didn't flinch. She placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her, reached into it, and pulled out the same binder she had been reading up front. The businessman kept typing. Jasmine didn't look at him. She simply flipped open the binder and resumed her work, her highlighter in hand like a scalpel, cutting across lines of policy with precision. And just like that, the seat that had once been filled with shame and silence now held someone who refused to sit quietly. It was more than a gesture. It was a challenge. A quiet one, but no less sharp. And for the first time since the plane took off, the man beside her finally paused. His typing slowed. His hands hovered above the keyboard. He could feel it too. The shift, not just in the seat, but in the story. The old veteran now sat quietly in Jasmine's former seat, the soft leather of first class, a world away from row 29. He hadn't reclined. He hadn't touched the drink the attendant offered him. He simply stared out the window, hands resting on his bag, shoulders stiff with the weight of too many years. But then, after a long silence, something inside him shifted, and he began to speak. The woman sitting next to him, probably in her mid-50s, had said nothing for the first few minutes. She'd seen it all happen. She'd watched Jasmine rise, watched the old man walk forward slowly, watched the way he looked too stunned to smile. Now she looked over gently, voice soft. "That was something back there," she said. "What she did for you." The veteran didn't look at her at first. He just nodded faintly, as if the moment still hadn't fully settled in his chest. Then after a pause, his voice came, low and gravelly, like it hadn't been used in a while. "You don't see that much anymore," he said, "especially not from someone that young." The woman smiled. "She's got heart." He turned now, finally meeting her gaze. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Memory, maybe, or regret. "She reminded me of someone," he said. "Oh?" the woman asked. The veteran looked down, rubbed a thumb across the edge of the bronze star on his chest, then leaned back slowly in the seat, exhaling. "After I came back from Afghanistan, I had nothing. I'd been through 2 tours. My leg was half shot. My marriage was over. My family had moved on. And when I got back to Texas, I didn't even have a place to sleep." The woman's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "I was on the street," he continued. "Downtown Dallas. I had the same bag." He patted the worn leather at his feet. "And a pair of boots with holes in them. I'd walk all day just to keep warm. Sit outside 24-hour diners hoping someone would drop their leftovers." His voice didn't crack. He wasn't telling the story for pity. He was simply remembering. "I'd stopped talking to people. You stop talking when no one looks you in the eye for long enough. You just start disappearing." The woman placed a hand over her mouth. "That's awful." He gave a tired chuckle. "It was normal. For us, it becomes normal. Veterans get thanked with bumper stickers, but not places to sleep." She said nothing, only nodded slowly. "One morning," he continued, "I was sitting outside the courthouse steps trying to keep my feet out of the sun. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, and this guy walks by, young, sharp, suit didn't fit perfect, but you could tell he was trying to make it. Black guy, maybe early 30s, lawyer judging by the briefcase." The woman leaned in slightly. The hum of the plane faded into background noise. "He looked at me," the old man said. "Not past me, not through me, at me. And he said, 'You served?' I didn't even answer, just nodded once. He sat down next to me right there on the steps. Said his name was Crockett. Didn't ask for my story, just listened while I gave it anyway." The woman blinked. Crockett? The veteran nodded. He bought me lunch, took me to a shelter he worked with, said he'd come back the next day. And he did. For 2 weeks straight, he kept showing up, got me signed up for VA assistance, made calls, filled out forms I didn't know how to read anymore. He stopped, swallowing hard. Then he told me, "You carried this country. Now let me carry you for a bit." The woman touched her chest, her voice low. "He sounds incredible." "He was," the veteran said. "He didn't just help me. He brought in 4 others after me. Men like me, worn down, forgotten. He built something real." Then he paused again, this time longer. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "He died a few years ago. Cancer. I never got to thank him properly. I meant to. But you know how time runs ahead of you when you're not looking." The woman said nothing, just gave him space. "I never knew if he had kids," he continued. "But when that young woman stood up today, the way she carried herself, the way she looked at me, not like I was a burden, but like I mattered, it hit me." His hand moved again to the metal. "And then I heard her name when the attendant spoke it." He turned to face the woman fully now. "Jasmine Crockett." Her jaw dropped slightly, eyes wide. "You think she's—" He nodded once, slow and sure. "His daughter. I'd bet my life on it." The woman looked down the aisle toward the back of the plane, where Jasmine now sat in row 29, shoulders straight, eyes fixed on a policy binder, like she hadn't just turned a moment into a movement. "That's unbelievable," the woman whispered. "She had no idea who you were?" "None," he said. "Didn't matter." The woman shook her head, blinking fast. "That's not kindness. That's legacy." The veteran smiled faintly. "Yeah, and today, it caught up with me." He turned back to the window now, staring out into the vast blue sky. And somewhere behind him, in the tightest seat on the plane, Jasmine Crockett sat upright, unaware that the man she had honored was one of the few who had once been helped by her own father. Unaware that the very values she carried, compassion, service, justice, had once been lived out by the man who raised her. But soon she would know, and the story of a seat swap would become something far bigger, something generational, something real. As the engines hummed and the plane coasted steadily through clouded skies, the cabin had returned to a fragile quiet. But up front in seat 2A, a storm was still stirring behind the veteran's eyes. He'd spent years trying to forget, then years trying to remember, and now something in him told him it was time, not to finish a story, but to finally return it to the hands it belonged to. He stood slowly, pressing both hands against the armrests like he was pushing against the weight of gravity and history at once. His knees resisted, his spine stiffened. But he moved, not for comfort, not for show, for closure. A few first-class passengers noticed and shifted slightly, unsure if they should offer help or space. He gave no sign he needed either. He gripped the edge of his seat for balance, then took up his old leather bag, the one that had followed him from the battlefield to the sidewalk to this plane, and started walking back. Every step down the aisle was deliberate, quiet, but heavier than any the plane had felt all flight. He passed row after row, row 10, row 15, row 20. And as he walked, passengers began to recognize him again. Not just as the man who'd been offered a seat, but as something more now, something living inside a story that had spread through the cabin like a current. A few whispered, a few simply watched. And finally he reached her. Row 29. She was sitting exactly where he had, her long frame folded into the narrow seat like it didn't belong, because it didn't. The same lack of legroom, the same overused air vent sputtering quietly above. She sat still, posture firm, binder on her lap, pen balanced between her fingers, though she hadn't written a word in pages. As if sensing his presence, she looked up before he could speak. Their eyes met. He didn't smile. Not yet. There was too much in his chest to reach that far. He reached out his hand instead, palm rough and shaking slightly. She stood immediately. He took her hand in both of his and held it gently, reverently, like something sacred. The cabin fell into a hush again, not because of spectacle, but because some moments demand reverence by their very existence. His voice, when it came, was low and slow, but clear. The kind of voice shaped by years of saying too little and caring too much. "Your father saved me," he said. Jasmine's breath hitched just barely. He tightened his grip, not painfully, just to ground the words. "Years ago, I was sleeping on the ground outside a courthouse in Dallas. I was angry, broke, hungry, invisible. People walked past me like I didn't exist. Then one day, your father stopped." She didn't speak. Her lips parted slightly, but she couldn't find the words. "He sat beside me like I was a person, not a headline, not a mistake. He didn't throw money at me. He didn't lecture me. He listened. He helped. Got me a roof. Got me a second chance." Jasmine's fingers tightened around his without realizing it. I never forgot that face. His voice. The way he told me, "You serve this country. Now let this country serve you." The cabin had gone completely silent now. Even the businessman next to her was frozen, eyes wide, lips slightly parted as if caught mid-thought. The veteran looked at Jasmine fully now, his eyes clearer than before. "When you stood up today, when you looked at me like I mattered, I didn't understand why it felt familiar. Not at first." He paused and Jasmine could feel her heartbeat in her throat. "But when I heard your name, Crockett, it hit me," he said. "You're his daughter." Her lips trembled. "You knew my dad," she whispered. "I owe him everything," the old man said. "And today you reminded me that what he gave didn't die with him. You gave me more than a seat. You gave me memory. You gave me dignity again. You reminded me, I'm not forgotten." She stared at him, tears building, blinking fast. Her voice, when it finally broke through the tightness in her throat, was quiet but raw. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know he helped you." "You didn't need to," he said, shaking his head. "You're living what he taught. You are what he left behind." Her eyes dropped for a second. When they rose again, they were shimmering. "Now I understand." The old man smiled faintly, a slow, tired smile that carried more truth than 1,000 words. "He'd be proud," he said simply. "Not because of what you gave me today, but because you gave it without knowing who I was." They stood like that for another moment. Two strangers bound not by blood, but by legacy. Then he squeezed her hand one last time and let go. Jasmine watched him as he stepped away and made his way slowly down the aisle. She sat again, but nothing felt the same. Not the seat, not the noise around her, not the hum of the engine or the headlines waiting in her folder. She stared down at her father's name on the old campaign button clipped to her laptop bag. She had packed it for luck. Now it felt like fate. The businessman beside her opened his mouth as if to say something, but didn't. He just stared straight ahead. And Jasmine Crockett, daughter of a man who once knelt beside the broken and helped them stand, sat still in row 29, her father's spirit resting quietly between the rows, and the weight of his legacy no longer something she carried alone. It had been passed on, and now it lived in her. The moment between Jasmine Crockett and the elderly veteran had settled into stillness, but it echoed through the plain like a slow-building storm. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of moment that rearranges the atmosphere. Quiet, but impossible to forget. The cabin was still midair, but something inside it had already landed. Truth. Passengers didn't look at their phones. They weren't scrolling or tapping or half listening. They were present, alert, changed. The murmurs that had followed Jasmine's seat swap had evolved into a collective silence, almost reverence. You could feel the weight of it in the air. A woman in 19A, who earlier had been flipping through a fashion magazine, now stared blankly at the back of the seat in front of her. A flight attendant stood frozen at the galley curtain, her hands folded tightly at her waist, blinking more than usual. The man in 29C, who had just an hour earlier barked about old guys taking up space, now sat with his hands in his lap, his laptop untouched on the tray. His gaze was low, distant, as if he'd been forced to watch himself from the outside and hadn't liked what he saw. He swallowed hard, opened his mouth to speak, then shut it again. No words could compete with what had just unfolded. It was the teenage girl in 28B who whispered first, leaning toward her mother. Why did she give up her seat for him? Her voice was soft but inquisitive. The mother, maybe in her late 30s, looked toward Jasmine in the row behind, her brows furrowed in thought. Because, she said after a beat, some people still remember what respect looks like. Respect. That was the word that hovered now, invisible but everywhere. Not politeness, not pity, not performance. Real respect. Earned but often forgotten. Jasmine had reminded them all what it looked like. In 22D, a middle-aged man in a denim jacket rubbed his jaw, then turned to his wife and said, "You think she knew who he was?" The woman shook her head slowly. "Doesn't matter. She saw enough." And that was it. Jasmine hadn't acted on recognition. She hadn't done it because the man had medals on his chest or a story waiting to be heard. She had acted because she saw someone being diminished, and she refused to let it continue. That kind of clarity is rare. That kind of courage, even more so. The flight attendant, who had helped orchestrate the switch, walked slowly down the aisle now, checking on passengers. But her eyes lingered on Jasmine each time she passed. There was something unreadable in her gaze. Admiration, maybe, or reflection. Perhaps both. No one clapped. No one stood up to make a speech. But the silence was no longer empty. It was full of something alive, something slowly transforming the space. A collective conscience. A moment that had cracked through everyone's personal bubble and connected them, briefly, to something larger than themselves. The businessman beside Jasmine, the same man who had earlier muttered about legroom and deadlines, finally shifted. He looked at her, hesitated, then said quietly, "That was unexpected." Jasmine didn't look up from the binder on her lap. She just said, "Sometimes what's right doesn't need to be expected. It just needs to be done." He looked away. He had no argument. Back in first class, the veteran sat quietly in seat 2A, his hands resting gently on the armrests. He hadn't reclined. He hadn't touched his drink. He just looked out the window, the sunlight catching his profile, making him look not old, but eternal. Like a statue placed there on purpose, not by accident. Beside him, a woman in a navy blue cardigan cleared her throat. "If you don't mind me saying," she said, "that young woman, she did something remarkable." The veteran turned slowly. "She did more than that," he said. "She reminded me that I was never invisible." The woman blinked, then smiled softly. "I hope my daughter grows up to be like her." The veteran nodded. "So do I." And then, as if that moment had been waiting for its cue, the plane shuddered slightly. The pilot came over the intercom, announcing their descent into the city. People sat straighter. Seatbelts clicked. But the energy didn't shift back to normal. It couldn't. The story had already settled into their bones. As the wheels touched the ground and the brakes engaged, people began gathering their things. But for once, no one rushed. They waited, row by row, slowly, respectfully. And Jasmine Crockett sat still in her cramped middle seat, her father's legacy now resting not just in her memory, but in her bones, her breath, her presence. She didn't need to explain herself, because everyone on board already knew. Something important had just happened, and none of them would walk off that plane quite the same. The wheels touched the runway with a soft, measured bump, followed by the familiar low roar of the reverse thrusters kicking in. The aircraft slowed steadily, gently, but there was no applause. No celebratory chatter, just silence, deep, contemplative, and alive with something unsaid. The seatbelt light blinked on. Passengers stirred, but no one rushed to undo their belts. The plane might have landed, but inside the cabin, people were still somewhere else. Somewhere suspended between what had just happened and what it meant. Jasmine Crockett remained in her seat in row 29, her back straight, her shoulders square. The policy binder still lay on her lap, unopened since before takeoff. Her eyes weren't reading. They were locked forward, fixed not on the aisle but on memory, on the weight of the hand she had held. The quiet gravel of the veteran's voice when he said, "Your father saved me." The raw honesty in the space between his sentences. The cabin moved slowly, deliberately, as though nobody wanted to break whatever spell had settled over the space. Across the aisle, a woman with a toddler gently patted her child's back, her eyes occasionally drifting toward Jasmine. One row ahead, a young man who had spent most of the flight in headphones now sat with them around his neck, his phone untouched in his lap. The businessman in 29C, the man who had barked about legroom, who had once spat annoyance into the space between them, sat wordlessly, elbows off the armrest, gaze lowered. He hadn't touched his laptop in over an hour, hadn't looked Jasmine in the eye since she took the seat beside him. He looked like a man who'd been forced to see something in himself that he didn't like and couldn't look away from. He cleared his throat. "I didn't mean," he began, his voice hoarse, but Jasmine didn't turn. She wasn't angry. She just didn't need to hear it. She spoke softly, still looking ahead. "Sometimes the only thing to say is nothing. Just do better next time." He nodded silently, folding his hands in his lap. Up front, the elderly veteran had already stood. He waited beside the exit doors, his old leather bag on one shoulder, his figure small but somehow towering. The flight attendant closest to him offered a kind smile and said quietly, "Thank you for flying with us, sir, and thank you for everything else." The old man smiled gently. "I'm just grateful someone still remembers." From front to back, the rest of the plane began moving. Row by row, passengers rose, collected their bags, stepped forward. But no one shoved, no one raced to the door. People waited, people paused. Because now everyone had been reminded, some moments are more important than being first off the plane. Jasmine rose when her row was called. She lifted her carry-on with ease, slipped the binder into the side pouch, and stepped into the aisle. As she made her way forward, quiet nods followed her. A middle-aged man in 24A murmured, "God bless you, ma'am." A woman gently reached out and touched her arm with a whispered thank you. Even the teenager from earlier, who had asked her mother why Jasmine gave up her seat, now looked up at her with wide, thoughtful eyes. Like maybe she had just witnessed something she'd carry for life. But Jasmine didn't seek attention. She didn't smile for cameras. She just walked, tall, quiet, certain. At the end of the jet bridge near the terminal entrance, the veteran was waiting, standing just to the side, away from the path of the crowd. His coat was straightened now, his expression calm, but his eyes lit up the moment Jasmine appeared. She walked toward him, her bag still slung over her shoulder. No words exchanged at first, just mutual recognition, not just of identity, but of meaning. He extended his hand. She took it, firmly, both of hers wrapping around his like it might disappear otherwise. "I didn't want to leave without thanking you one more time," he said. "I'm the one who should be thanking you," she replied softly. He smiled, something about it softer now. "Your father saved me," he said again, repeating the words like a vow. "He gave me a path when I didn't think I had one. He saw me, listened to me, fought for me when I had no strength left to fight for myself." Jasmine's breath caught, but she kept her gaze steady. "He never told me that story." "He wouldn't have," the veteran said with a dry chuckle. "He didn't help for attention. He helped because it was the right thing. Quietly, consistently." Her throat tightened. "And today," he said, eyes glistening, "you made me feel like I hadn't been forgotten, like I still mattered. That meant more than I can explain." She blinked quickly, willing the emotion to stay in check. "I didn't know who you were," she said, "but now that I do, I'm honored." "You didn't need to know," he said. "You saw me. That's all that mattered, and that's how I know. His legacy's alive in you." Jasmine nodded, lips pressed together, the ache in her chest now warm, full, purposeful. The veteran stepped back slowly, gave her one final nod, and turned toward the terminal, blending into the crowd. A man now seen, heard, and remembered. Jasmine didn't move right away. She stood still for a beat longer, letting the weight of everything settle. Around her, the airport had returned to its normal rhythms. Flashing signs, overhead announcements, shuffling feet. But inside her, nothing was the same. At baggage claim, the carousel hummed to life. Luggage tumbled onto the belt. But Jasmine didn't rush to find hers. She sat down on the bench beside the glass wall, watching travelers reunite, watching motion and noise re-enter the world. Her phone buzzed. Again and again. She finally pulled it out. Her notifications were exploding. A video had been posted by a man seated mid-cabin, someone who had quietly filmed a part of the exchange. The video was short, simple. It showed Jasmine standing to give up her seat. The veteran's slow walk forward, then a cut to the old man's hand on hers in the terminal. The caption read, "She didn't know this man was once saved by her father, but today she carried his legacy, a daughter's instinct, a hero's blood." Jasmine watched the clip once, quietly. It had already passed 300,000 views. Comments flooded in. "She didn't do it for the camera. You can tell. This is what we need more of. Quiet courage." I cried. Real leadership. Her inbox was filled with media requests, interview offers, appearances, trending hashtags. She ignored all of it. Instead, she opened her email and typed one quick message to her team. No interviews, no quotes, no spotlight. "Let's quietly find 3 veterans this week who need help. Housing, health care, legal aid, just like my father would have done. No press, just action." She hit send. Then she switched off her phone. A few minutes later, a familiar voice approached. The same flight attendant from earlier, now in civilian clothes, coat folded over her arm, bag slung across her chest. She smiled as she stepped closer. "Hey," she said, voice warm but tentative. "Just wanted to say thank you for what you did." Jasmine rose from the bench. "It was the right thing to do," she said simply. The woman nodded. "I've worked a lot of flights, seen all kinds of people, but I've never seen anyone do what you did today. Not like that. Quiet, honest, no speeches, just heart." Jasmine returned the smile, tired but full. "Thank you," she said, "but it wasn't about me." The attendant nodded again, then stepped away, disappearing into the crowd. Jasmine stood alone again, bag now rolling behind her as she headed toward the exit. And as she passed through the automatic doors into the waiting city beyond, she carried with her more than a bag. She carried a name, a legacy, a promise quietly fulfilled, and still unfolding. By the time Jasmine Crockett exited the airport terminal and stepped into the soft light of late afternoon, the moment on the plane had already started to echo far beyond the cabin. What had been intimate, a quiet exchange between a veteran and a stranger, was now a spark. The clip posted by the man in seat 14C had gone viral. A single minute of footage. Jasmine standing, handing over her seat, the old man's hand gripping hers, his whispered words, her stillness. It wasn't polished. It wasn't framed for clicks. It just was. And maybe that's why it struck so deep. It had been captioned simply, "She didn't do it for a camera. She didn't know who he was. But somehow she knew what to do." By the time Jasmine's driver opened the car door outside the terminal, the video had surpassed 500,000 views. Inside the car, her phone buzzed relentlessly. Press requests, notifications, quote inquiries from major networks. Her staff group chat was on fire. CNN, "Can we have her on for a live segment tonight?" Fox News, "Carried her father's legacy. America needs this story." The View, "We'd love to fly her out." Jasmine stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned it face down on the seat beside her. The hum of the city returned around her, but her mind was elsewhere. On her father, on that man's voice, on the weight of the moment she still hadn't completely absorbed. In her silence, the car rolled forward. As they turned onto Interstate 35, she finally spoke. "Can we stop somewhere quiet?" The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, surprised. "Sure. Any place in mind?" She thought for a moment. Somewhere, public but calm. A park. 10 minutes later, she sat on a weathered wooden bench at the edge of a quiet green space overlooking the Trinity River. Kids played in the distance. An old couple walked a small dog along the path. And Jasmine sat there, her phone still off, her thoughts full. She reached into her bag and pulled out an old campaign pin. Her father's. It had been there, tucked away in the lining, for years. Faded gold lettering, Crockett for justice. She turned it in her hands slowly, her fingertips brushing the edge. She could remember him wearing it at community centers, at VFW halls and courtrooms. Never flashy, just firm, present, steady. Her father had never asked for attention. He never went viral, but every day he showed up, and he helped people the world had forgotten. No cameras, no hashtags, just long hours, a folding chair, and a notepad filled with names. And now here she was, being asked to turn his legacy into content. She opened her phone briefly, just to respond to her staff. No interviews, no media. Let's honor him with action, not airtime. Find 3 vets, real need, real help, quietly. Within minutes, her team responded. On it. Already looking into 2 leads from South Dallas. One case looks like a wrongful eviction. VFW referred him. Jasmine allowed herself a soft smile. That was her father's playbook. Not posture, purpose. Across the city, however, the story was already running ahead of her. Social media was ablaze. Legacy in flight was trending. A compilation video appeared, combining cell phone clips, flight details, and side-by-side photos of Jasmine and her late father. A voiceover read the veteran's quote, "Your father saved me. Today you made me feel remembered," followed by Jasmine's simple, shaken response, "I didn't know, but now I understand." Comment sections filled with praise. This is what real leadership looks like. Didn't even know who he was. That's the part that breaks me. Her father planted the seed, she became the tree. But with praise, of course, came cynicism. The internet never slept. One political blog asked, was it genuine? Or a PR move by a rising political figure? Another comment read, camera just happened to be rolling? Sure. And below that, she didn't even know she was being recorded. This is real. Jasmine didn't engage. She wouldn't feed it. Instead, she texted her outreach coordinator directly. We'll handle the first 2 vets personally. I want to sit with them. Talk, no headlines. That evening, she sat alone at her kitchen table. Her husband had taken their daughter to visit family, leaving her in rare solitude. She didn't turn on the TV. Instead, she laid out 3 old photos of her father, one at a legal aid booth, one shaking hands with a veteran outside a shelter, one sitting in a folding chair beside a woman clutching court papers. In each photo, he wasn't posing. He was listening. She whispered aloud to the empty kitchen. I get it now, Dad. I get why you never needed the stage. Her voice cracked on the last word. The next morning, the story had broken across every major network. She woke to her name in headlines. Praised, quoted, misinterpreted, repackaged. But she didn't care. Because that morning, she wasn't giving interviews. She was standing outside a small 1-bedroom apartment in South Dallas, shaking hands with a veteran who hadn't had running water for 3 months. She sat at his kitchen table, sleeves rolled up, taking notes as he explained the paperwork. No cameras, just a notepad and a coffee mug with a chipped handle. Later, she visited a homeless outreach center and asked one simple question. Who have we missed? And that evening, as the sun went down, she placed a call to the veteran from the flight. No script, just voice. He picked up. Miss Crockett, she smiled. I wanted to say thank you, again. You already did, he replied. No, she said. Thank you for reminding me what matters. There was a pause, then he said, we need more like you. We need more like you, she replied, and I promise, we won't forget again. When the call ended, she walked to the old shelf in her living room, placed her father's pin in the center, and beside it added a note. Just 5 words. Legacy isn't noise, it's action, and Jasmine Crockett was just getting started. Long after the plane had landed, long after the passengers had gone their separate ways and the engines had cooled on the tarmac, the real gravity of what had happened still hung in the air. Not in news cycles, not in hashtags, but in hearts. Because this wasn't just a story about a woman and a veteran. It was a confrontation with everything we pretend not to see. A reckoning with how quietly injustice can slip past us when we let comfort dull our instincts. On that plane, injustice hadn't raised its voice. It hadn't thrown punches or broken laws. It had simply sat in the form of indifference, a businessman's entitled sigh, the weary shifting of a forgotten old man, a cabin full of passengers who looked away, until one person didn't. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout. She didn't argue. She didn't perform. She just stood, gave up her comfort, disrupted the order, and in doing so, forced the entire cabin, and eventually a nation, to stop and ask, what would I have done? That's the question that makes this story matter. Because every day we are faced with 1,000 versions of that same moment. The ignored, the dismissed, the voices interrupted, the veterans waiting too long for care, the elderly overlooked at bus stops, the mother judged at the checkout line. Most injustices don't come with a soundtrack. They come in silence. And it's what we do in that silence that defines who we are. Jasmine's act was not extraordinary because it was grand. It was extraordinary because it was uncomplicated. She saw wrong and she refused to tolerate it, not with rage, but with presence. She filled the gap that others left empty. And in that act, she taught us something most of us have forgotten. That power is not just what you hold. It's what you give up voluntarily when someone else needs it more. There was something especially cruel about the scene before Jasmine intervened. The man who had served his country, who had bled, likely buried friends, and returned to a nation that too often thanks its soldiers only when convenient, was being dismissed by someone who thought their Wi-Fi, their schedule, their comfort mattered more. That's the tragedy, not the aggression, but the apathy. He didn't ask to be honored. He didn't expect thanks. He shrank politely to make room for the man who wanted him to disappear. He apologized for existing, and maybe that's the most heartbreaking part. We have trained some of the best among us to apologize for taking up space. But Jasmine reminded us all that some people have already paid for their seat, in blood, in years, in silence. When she gave up her place in first class, a seat she had earned, a privilege she had never demanded, she wasn't showing generosity. She was restoring balance. She was making room for history. She was saying without a single raised voice, "You will not be pushed aside here." And what makes it more powerful still? She didn't know who he was. She didn't know that years ago, her father, a young community lawyer in Dallas, had once helped that same man up from the curb of a courthouse, given him shelter, and restored his dignity. She acted not from knowledge but from instinct, the kind of instinct that only comes when values have been planted deep, through quiet teaching, through legacy. And that legacy, her father's, surfaced in her like muscle memory. Unspoken, unrehearsed, just there when it mattered. That's what real inheritance looks like. Not money, not power, but principle. And it matters more than we like to admit. We live in a culture saturated with performance, where virtue is branded, empathy is curated, and morality comes with filters. But Jasmine's act cut through all of that, because it wasn't performative, it was private, and it only became public because someone else happened to witness it. And thank God they did, because we need stories like this now, desperately. We need to be reminded that not all heroes carry rank, that sometimes the bravest people in the room are the ones who quietly do what others won't, without waiting for permission or applause, that sometimes the most powerful protest is to yield, to give space, to listen. And that's what Jasmine did. She didn't raise a fist, she offered a hand. And in doing so, she exposed the real imbalance in the room, that a man who had once fought for all of us now had to fight to be seen, that a plane full of people, educated and well-traveled, didn't stop until a single woman asked, "Why is no one doing anything?" There are layers to this story that will live beyond its initial telling. One layer is justice, correcting a wrong. One is legacy, unknowingly honoring the past. And one, perhaps the most important, is awareness. The realization that we are the ones in the aisle every day, walking past people who deserve our seat, our time, our kindness. We like to think we would do what Jasmine did, but would we? Would we give up our comfort if no one was watching? Would we intervene when injustice doesn't scream but whispers? Would we, in our own quiet ways, carry the weight of someone else's burden for a little while? That's the question Jasmine leaves us with. She didn't leave that plane with headlines in mind. She left with responsibility. She didn't respond to virality with branding. She responded with more service, visiting struggling veterans, arranging housing, setting up legal aid quietly, without hashtags or lights. Because that's what legacy demands. Not moments, Movements, not gestures, consistency, and now the lesson becomes ours to carry it forward. To remember that every seat we hold, in a room, in a conversation, in society, is a chance to lift someone else, to invite them into dignity, to say with our actions, you belong. And if enough of us do that, quietly, daily, truthfully, then maybe we stop needing heroes, because we all become one moment at a time. Jasmine Crockett's quiet act of justice had already stirred something personal, something intimate, but it didn't end with her. Like all real moments of integrity, it began to spread, not as noise, but as a spark, a ripple, a call. What began as a single choice on a single plane seat ignited something far greater. Within days, veterans organizations across the country reported a surge in calls, not for assistance, but for gratitude. People were reaching out, not asking for help, but offering it. Young volunteers showed up unannounced at VFW halls with donated meals. High school students organized coat drives for homeless veterans. A diner in North Carolina posted a handwritten sign, "Veterans eat free," because Jasmine Crockett reminded us why we're here. The moment had cracked open a wound this nation had long tried to bandage with slogans. Support our troops, land of the free. But for once, the actions matched the words. In a quiet corner of Montana, a small-town mayor issued a local executive order declaring the last Friday of every month Veteran Visibility Day. He cited Jasmine's story in his speech. "This isn't politic," he said. "This is about finally remembering those we never should have forgotten." From Arizona to Pennsylvania, local governments followed suit, not because of pressure, but because of conscience. Even corporations jumped in. A regional airline announced a new policy. Every flight, one first-class seat reserved for a veteran, paid, not discounted. It wasn't a PR stunt. It was policy. And it was born from the image of a woman in a navy blue suit, standing silently while the world watched her do what no one else had. But perhaps the most powerful change happened where no cameras reached, in homes. Families started talking to their children about what service meant. Teenagers who had never thought about war began asking their grandparents about Vietnam, Korea, Desert Storm. Old medals were dusted off, not to be displayed, but to be remembered. The story had tapped into a national conscience, one buried under years of hurry and disconnection. And Jasmine? She didn't tweet. She didn't pose for photos. She kept visiting veterans one by one, in shelters and courtrooms, in waiting rooms and side streets. She showed up because she understood now. Remembering isn't a headline. It's a habit, a discipline, a duty. And all it took to remind a nation was one moment, one seat, one woman who saw what others wouldn't and refused to sit still. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.